Michael Harrison received a shocking demand from his own HOA to replace the roof of his house, a rule he had already designed and approved himself. Deborah Miller, the HOA president, arrogantly tried to enforce her authority, treating him like just another rule breaker, but Michael had a revelation up his sleeve that turned the entire situation upside down. And just wait until you see how he reclaimed control, proving once and for all that justice in Sunset View would not be denied. Michael Harrison had just returned from his morning coffee run when the thick envelope slipped through the mail slot of his front door. At first, he thought it was another routine HOA newsletter or maybe a reminder about community events. But the moment he picked it up, something about the crisp paper and the official seal made him pause. With careful fingers, he opened it, expecting the usual reminders about lawn maintenance or upcoming meetings. What he found instead made his heart skip a beat. The document wasn't polite. It wasn't a friendly request. It was a formal demand, drafted in a tone so cold and legalistic that it felt more like a decree than a notice. The HOA was insisting that he replace the roof of his house immediately. They listed deadlines, potential fines, and even the possibility of legal action if he failed to comply. Michael's eyes scanned the words over and over, disbelief rooting him to the spot. He reread the paragraphs, hoping some mistake or clerical error would jump out at him, but every sentence reinforced the same shocking message: change the roof or face consequences. Michael had owned the entire Sunset View neighborhood for over a decade. Every brick, every tile, every tree lining the streets had been his decision. He had spent years carefully selecting designs, colors, and materials, ensuring that the houses not only looked beautiful, but maintained a cohesive style that would stand the test of time. The thought that some committee, an organization he had largely ignored because it seemed insignificant, would now attempt to dictate terms to him was incomprehensible. His mind raced. How could this be happening? He had attended meetings years ago, offered advice to community members, and even funded upgrades to public areas to make Sunset View one of the most desirable neighborhoods around. He had been the one ensuring the rules were followed, not bending to anyone else's whims. The shock was almost physical, a cold weight pressing down on his chest. It was as if the air in the room had suddenly thickened, constricting his breathing. Michael set the letter down on the kitchen counter, running a hand through his hair. He stared out the window at the sun glinting off the roofs he had personally designed. Each one was perfect in his eyes, a reflection of years of meticulous planning. And now, according to the HOA, they were somehow deficient. They had deemed his personal choices as violations, issuing a command that not only undermined his authority, but threatened to impose fines that could escalate absurdly if ignored. The sense of disbelief soon morphed into a strange mix of confusion and incredulity. He couldn't help but replay the moment in his head, the weight of the envelope, the official seal, the cold, precise words printed on the page. It didn't make sense. Michael had always thought of the HOA as a background presence, a group of neighbors who managed the community's minor issues. Never had he imagined that such a body would presume to wield power over him, the person who had built the very foundation of their community. As the minutes stretched, the initial shock deepened. Michael felt a tingling sensation in his chest, a combination of disbelief and rising tension. He knew he would need to respond, but first he had to process the absurdity of the situation. The sheer audacity of the letter, its bureaucratic arrogance, and the implicit threat it carried had left him momentarily stunned. For the first time in years, Michael Harrison, the man who owned Sunset View, felt truly powerless. Or at least, that was how it seemed at that very moment. He sank into a chair, gripping the edges of the envelope as if it were a fragile lifeline. In the quiet of his kitchen, with sunlight spilling over the countertops and illuminating the roof outside, Michael Harrison realized one undeniable truth. Something had gone terribly wrong. And this was only the beginning. Days passed after Michael Harrison received the shocking notice from the HOA, but the tension in Sunset View only seemed to grow. Every morning, Michael would step outside and notice small but deliberate signs of the HOA's push to enforce their authority. Letters had begun circulating to neighbors, each one meticulously listing alleged violations of community standards. The tone was polite on the surface, almost formal, but beneath it lingered an unmistakable implication. Michael Harrison, despite owning the entire subdivision, was being treated as a problem to be corrected. Deborah Miller, the HOA president, seemed to take a particular interest in the unfolding drama. She moved with a confidence that was almost theatrical, attending neighborhood meetings with an air of certainty, outlining rules, citing bylaws, and subtly reminding everyone that even the most minor infractions could carry penalties. To Michael, it wasn't just the letters or the meetings. It was the way she acted as if she had authority over him. Every word she spoke, every nod from the board members, every approving glance from neighbors who had never questioned her judgment before, fanned the flames of Michael's growing frustration. What made it worse was the way Deborah framed Michael's actions. She painted him as just another resident who had failed to comply, as though the person who had built the streets, landscaped the parks, and approved the entire architectural plan of the subdivision was somehow guilty of breaking arbitrary rules. Michael watched in disbelief as neighbors, many of whom had admired his work for years, began to quietly question his choices. The sting of being misjudged and misunderstood gnawed at him. His hatred didn't appear suddenly. It crept in insidious and deliberate, fueled by each new letter, each hushed comment, and each instance of Deborah's smug assertiveness. He began to recognize the pattern. This wasn't about community standards at all. It was about power. Deborah and her team were attempting to assert dominance over him, someone they clearly had no understanding of. Their arrogance, their presumption, and their blind confidence that they could override the very person who had shaped Sunset View were infuriating. Michael's mind replayed the interactions over and over, the smirks, the polite but patronizing tones, the subtle attempts to sway neighbors' opinions. It all crystallized into a singular emotion that he could no longer ignore. Hatred, sharp and electric, surged through him, not a blind, irrational anger, but a controlled, burning recognition of audacity and disrespect. Every day he saw reminders that his patience was being tested. A notice slipped under his door. A board member casually pointing out some minor flaw during a neighborhood walk. A whispered remark in the local cafe. It was as if the entire HOA machinery had turned against him, and their misjudgment of his role in the community only intensified the fire within. Finally, after one particularly tense meeting where Deborah continued her campaign of subtle manipulation, Michael felt a breaking point. His patience had snapped. The hatred that had been simmering quietly was now a roaring demand for action. He could no longer remain silent, allowing people who understood nothing about Sunset View to dictate terms to the man who had built it. It was time to reclaim control, to confront the audacity head on, and to make it unmistakably clear who truly held authority in the neighborhood. In those quiet, tense moments after the meeting, as Michael walked back to his house, he realized that the battle had only just begun. The fire of hatred was not destructive. It was a signal, a catalyst for the confrontation that was coming. And Michael knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not allow this arrogance to go unchallenged. Michael Harrison had spent sleepless nights replaying the events of the past week. Every letter from the HOA, every whispered comment from neighbors, and every smug smile from Deborah Miller had added fuel to a fire that was now impossible to ignore. The initial shock and simmering hatred had transformed into a controlled, boiling rage, one that demanded action. He realized it was no longer enough to seethe quietly in the corners of his home. This confrontation needed to happen face to face, in the place where authority and assumptions collided, the HOA boardroom. On the morning of the meeting, Michael arrived earlier than anyone else, his suit crisp and his demeanor composed, almost serene. He placed his hands on the polished conference table, staring at the row of chairs reserved for the board members. He could sense the subtle tension in the room, the usual air of confidence that Deborah Miller carried with her. Today, however, that confidence would be tested. As the meeting began, the board members launched into their routine, polite yet accusatory comments, discussions of alleged violations, and suggestions that Michael had been non-compliant with community standards. They were articulate, organized, and unyielding, confident that the procedure itself lent them authority. Michael listened, his face calm, his eyes steady, but inside, the rage that had been building over days, the sense of injustice, the arrogance of the board, the condescending tone of Deborah, surged like a tide. When Deborah leaned forward, her voice firm and clipped, attempting to explain why Michael's roof was non-compliant, he finally spoke. His words were deliberate, slow, and sharp, cutting through the room with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "Are you sure you know who you're addressing?" he said, his voice calm but resonating with authority. "I am the owner of this entire subdivision. Every house, every roof, every rule you enforce. It was approved by me." The room fell silent. Mouths opened and closed, eyes widened, and pens paused mid-note. The weight of Michael's revelation sank in immediately. Deborah's confident posture wavered. The subtle smirks and nods that had accompanied her statements disappeared. Michael's rage was not loud or chaotic, but precise, cold, and unwavering, the kind of fury that commands respect because it is rooted in truth. The board members attempted to respond, citing bylaws and regulations, but their words stumbled against the undeniable reality of Michael's authority. Every argument they presented felt hollow, every objection evaporating under the steady weight of his presence. It was as if the room itself had shifted, the power dynamics rearranging in an instant, and Michael stood firmly at the center of it. For Michael, the rage was almost cathartic. It was the culmination of disbelief, frustration, and simmering resentment. The emotion that had fueled his patience, snapping into a clear, unstoppable force. He had rehearsed the words, but the satisfaction of seeing them land in that room, shattering assumptions and demanding acknowledgement, was instantaneous. By the time the meeting concluded, the atmosphere had transformed. There was no longer an air of control from the board, only reluctant acknowledgement. Deborah Miller's attempts at subtle persuasion had failed. The room understood that the man before them was not just another resident. He was the architect, the authority, and the ultimate decision maker. Michael left the boardroom that day with a sense of empowerment that went beyond mere victory. The rage had served its purpose. It had been focused, precise, and decisive. He had reclaimed control not through force, but through undeniable truth and unwavering resolve. In that moment, the simmering storm inside him finally found release, leaving behind a clarity and authority that no bureaucracy could challenge. Within a week, the landscape of Sunset View had changed in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. Michael Harrison had not needed to storm into meetings or issue ultimatums beyond the truth he had already revealed. The power of undeniable authority, grounded in years of work and dedication, was enough to shift the tide. The HOA, once so confident and self-assured, quietly rescinded all their demands. Official recognition of Michael's authority came in the form of a formal notice, carefully worded and courteous, yet carrying the weight of acknowledgement that no further attempts at interference would be tolerated. Deborah Miller, who had led the charge with such determination and confidence, no longer spoke with the same certainty. The subtle arrogance and patronizing tones that had dominated every meeting evaporated, replaced by a cautious deference. Her team, once eager to enforce every letter of the bylaws, now stepped back, recognizing that the man before them was not simply a resident, but the one who had built and guided the very community they claimed to serve. There was no animosity, no bitterness, only the quiet realization that authority could not be argued with when it was both rightful and irrefutable. For Michael, the sense of satisfaction was profound. It was not the triumph of ego or dominance, but the restoration of balance and fairness that had been disrupted by a bureaucratic overreach. Every detail of Sunset View, from the careful alignment of roof lines to the harmony of the streets, now stood secure, untouched by misinformed mandates. The neighborhood he had shaped with such care remained as he had envisioned it, and his role as the steward of that vision was no longer questioned. Neighbors who had watched the conflict unfold with curiosity and quiet concern began to recognize the truth themselves. Whispers of admiration spread as they realized the scope of Michael's contributions and the lengths to which he had gone to ensure the community's beauty and cohesion. In the privacy of their homes or during casual conversations over fences, many offered subtle applause or approving nods, silent acknowledgement of the justice that had been restored. There was a collective sense of relief and respect, a recognition that sometimes appearances can be deceiving, and that the quiet, unassuming individual may hold more power and wisdom than anyone imagines. Michael's own satisfaction went beyond the mere resolution of the dispute. It was the culmination of shock, frustration, and rage transformed into decisive action. He had faced arrogance and bureaucracy, and he had emerged not only victorious, but also measured and composed. The experience became a personal affirmation. Knowledge of one's rights, combined with patience and clarity of purpose, could turn even the most unfair and intimidating situations into triumph. In the weeks that followed, the story of Michael Harrison spread quietly through Sunset View. To newcomers, it became a cautionary tale of the limits of assumed authority. To longtime residents, it was a legend of patience, determination, and rightful power. Michael had not simply defended his property, he had restored a sense of justice and set a precedent that ensured fairness would always have a place in the community he had built. As he walked through the neighborhood, observing the sunlight glinting off rooftops and the carefully maintained streets, Michael felt a deep, enduring satisfaction. The battle had ended, the balance had returned, and the triumph was complete. In the heart of Sunset View, justice had prevailed, and the quiet pride of its true guardian resonated in every corner.